If we can.
Chairman Clayton.
Here.
Warren Danford Jr.
Here.
Robert Crumpatic. Alex Lynch.
Here.
Robert Micheluti Jr.
Here.
Michael Monahan.
Here.
Teresa Paulus.
Here.
David Oslett.
Here.
And Jim Osterhout.
Here.
Okay.
Jim had mentioned that Bob Crumpatic wanted to be excused.
I'm not sure what happened to Bob Crumpatic. I thought he was going to be here. I spoke to him.
He requests to be excused.
I'll make the motion to excuse Mr. Crumpatic.
Support.
Okay.
It's yours.
We have a motion to excuse Mr. Crumpatic. And all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? So ordered. Now if you all rise and join me in pledging allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now, we've changed the order of
Thank you.
this. If you've got
Should
an
make you sit
old,
through the whole meeting.
Yeah.
if you've got an old agenda listing, we're going to start out by having the Michigan Department of Environment, the Great Lakes and Energy, EGLE, and U.S. Army Corps of Engineers presentation.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I can't hear myself that well standing right here. Sorry, I got my back to a few folks here. My name is Shawn Sanchez. I work with the Army Corps of Engineers in the regulatory office. I'm here to do a presentation on kind of an introduction to what our program consists of and some of the things we get involved with. I've worked with the Corps for 23 years, and, well, we'll get started. I know you got a lot on your agenda, so. I'll give you the big picture first. USACE is obviously headquartered in our Washington, D.C. We have a division office in Cincinnati, which has about 5,000 employees. And more locally, we're in Detroit District. Here in downtown Detroit on the west side, we got about 500 employees. We're actually a global agency. We have a presence in every continent on the planet. So we do a lot of work, everything with waters and wetlands. As you can see, some of the main missions that we have up there. Our primary missions, as a lot of you know, are navigation. We do a lot of dredging. We take care of harbors. We have locks. We have hydropower and all sorts of other programs there. But the main reason we're here tonight is the lowest one there on the list, the regulatory program. We have field offices in our Detroit district in these locations. We got 2 in the Upper Peninsula, 3 in the Lower, and then 1 in northern Indiana. Here in the city of St. Clair Shores, you deal with our Detroit office primarily. Just like any great program, we have a mission. You see a lot of words up there, but our main mission is to try to make permit decisions in a reasonable, fair, balanced, and it's hard. As you all know on the board, it's a challenge bringing balance to when people want proposals and the environment we live around. So definitely a challenging job, no doubt. At the Corps, we have 2 main authorities we work with. We have Section 10 and the Rivers and Harbors Act, which you can see there, primarily deals with what we call navigable waters of the United States. So here in St. Clair Shores, think of Lake St. Clair. That's your navigable water. Any of your canal systems are all included in that. And sometimes even some of the tributaries that may flow into Lake St. Clair, or parts of them anyway. And you can see structures and work. So those are the kind of things we cover, like as an example of work, maybe dredging, for instance, and any kind of structures, docks, hoists. We'll get into that a little more. And then you also see the Clean Water Act. For Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, it's been under many renditions since the early 70s. Our primary basis is from 1977, and certainly there's been a lot of changes over time and even more recently too. So, but you'll see on there a discharge of dredged or filled material in waters of the United States, which also includes those navigable waters like Lake St. Clair and any adjacent wetlands. And when I say discharge of fill, let me just explain that a little. The discharge is basically like placement. So you're placing soil, dirt, rock, just some simple examples to kind of give you an idea. So if you're putting those in waters or wetlands, that's when we get involved. You can see a lot of vessels in this image. One of the main parts of Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act that deals mainly with structures is making it safe for commercial navigation. And just as an example, you can see how busy some of our waterways get. So that's a big part of that law that we look at when we review projects. Clean Water Act, again, just some examples, some pictures of actually some violation cases from the past that we've dealt with. Certainly you see in the upper right, the Cuyahoga River on fire for, I think, the 8th recorded time in history in that point in time. You know, just good reasons for Clean Water Act rules to come out, and they've come a long way, and certainly, you know, we don't cover certain chemical contaminations and things like that, but we do get involved with fill material, so it's a big part of our program. In this little schematic here, you'll see we have the navigable waters of the United States. So again, think of that synonymous here with Lake St. Clair. Think of the tributaries that run into it, the creeks, the streams, maybe even the county drains, any adjacent wetlands, things like that. That's what triggers our jurisdiction for certain permit reviews and processes that we follow. Here's a nice cross-section of our Section 10 program. You can see it's pretty much demarcated by our ordinary high water mark, which is a point on the shoreline where the water has its most influence. It's usually by physical marks as well. But you can see even greater than that, the Section 404 program, so that discharge of fill we regulate covers not only the waterway, but also adjacent wetlands as well. Now, next I've got about 10 slides of just some visual examples, just to get all our gears turning on some of these structures and projects that we talk about that typically require permits. So again, here in Lake St. Clair, any of the canal systems that connect to Lake St. Clair, and maybe even some of the tributaries too, at least the more waterward ends of those tributaries. Certainly we got a lot of marinas, breakwaters, boat ramps, and other pier structures, very prevalent here in the city. Got a lot of docks, boat hoists, pilings, even davits and mooring whips, things like that, that can turn or jut out in and over the waterway and certainly have a connection to boats tied off on them and other watercraft. Mooring buoys is another common one we see. Dredging, anytime you remove or scoop material out of a waterway or even a wetland, we consider that dredging. Whereas in comparison on land or upland, it'd be like excavation. So again, if you're dredging material out, and then where are you putting that material? That's another thing we like to know too. Bulkheads, especially with replacement bulkheads, seawalls, things like that, and the backfill is also part of what we review and look at with our program. And then I know you guys have a lot of beach areas and some of your parks, especially at lower water times, like back in the mid-2000s, we ran into this a lot where we had reemergent wetlands come up. So we had to create some programs where we were allowing some like in this example, some sand fill to be placed on the lake bed or even in some wetland areas with paths or areas where people could recreate. So these are some of the examples that are probably most common here. And then just as an example, you'll see on the slide, the image on the left, and then compare it to the right. It's hard to see in this picture, but there's a little corrugated metal pipe type culvert on the left-hand side. It's really tough to see, sorry about that. But it was replaced with a box culvert in that same location. And you also see the riprap or the stone that's out there as well for erosional protection. So Just some examples to kind of put some visuals to. And then we also look at any temporary measures that may be required for certain projects. Like in this case, maybe there was some fill that was placed or added to the waterway to allow for this bridge maintenance. And turbidity curtains that we have marked on there is a pretty common special condition that we'll require to help protect the aquatic resources. So other examples that may require a core permit, removal of structures also can require a permit, since that's considered work out on the navigable waters. Any kind of sewer, utility, water lines, things like that, whether above or even below. So they can be aerial lines, they can be submerged lines. That's another thing that we review pretty frequently. And then one thing we differ a little bit on the state with is that we actually require permits for all structures. So not just permanent year-round, but also seasonal structures too. The state can talk a little more on that, but they usually get involved when there's kind of a commercial aspect to it, if they're seasonal. Sometimes they'll still get involved, so. And like anything, we have some great flow charts. We have, this is kind of our order, our process that you can follow. We have pre-application meetings that we often tell people, if you would like to talk with us, meet with us, sometimes we could even come out on site if need be. It's always good to answer questions, to try to help guide people, applicants, on the right path. So of course, there's the application stage where you can formally submit an application with drawings, things like that. There's time for us to evaluate and coordinate those applications, and then at some point, we can make a permit decision. The permit application itself, you'll see the complete one is certainly the application form itself, a location map, drawings of plan view and cross-sectional view drawings that are required, any kind of dimensions or volumes that we want to ascertain on the drawings. Again, the dredging, if you're going to dredge, where are you going to put the material? And sometimes we need to know the adjacent property owner information too, so we can coordinate depending on the process we're using. Okay, I'm not moving. For some reason, this isn't advancing the slide now.
New battery.
We have basically 4 types of permits. We have general permits, which are more for minor projects. Technically, the regionals and nationwides are already authorized projects, and we verify to make sure they fit those criteria. So we'll say that we issued a regional or nationwide permit, but technically we're making sure they already fit the criteria. They've already been through environmental assessment and cumulative impact type analysis. And then our individual permits, those are for our more robust projects, a little more major projects, you could say. Letter of permission has some agency coordination. Usually those are just for structural type projects and even dredging. And then our standard permit, that's typically our most robust review that we do. We have a public notice, we have an environmental assessment, and we'll come to a permit decision. Now, I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek because right now I'm working on the Line 5 tunnel project up at the Straits. We're doing an environmental impact statement, so that is like our all-out robust review period. But that's probably been 40 years since we've done one of those, so it's kind of a rarity. But everybody wants to know how much and how long is it going to take. The fees, essentially, you either pay $10 or $100, and that's only if we issue a standard permit. All the other permits or even application submittals for the Corps, we have no charge. And you're only required to pay if we issue a permit. Now, this is some data from 2023, but this is kind of what our ideal timeline is. For our regionals and nationwides, we really shoot to have those done within 60 days. And you can see from our more robust projects, those are typically done within 120 days. But as you can see, the percentages aren't as high on that one. And there's a lot of reasons for coordination. Sometimes there's a lot of back and forth with the applicants. We really try to work with the applicants to try to make a project permittable, where it can still meet the needs of the project and still balance the needs of the environment. Again, very challenging, but those are the timelines we typically try to stay to as best we can. I mentioned some coordination. We do a lot of coordination with state agencies, federal agencies, and tribal nations, and sometimes municipalities as well. So adjacent property owners as well for some of the more robust projects. There's other permit requirements too. EGLE actually has the lead, so the state of Michigan for coastal zone management consistency and water quality certification. And those are some things that we're kind of dependent on with the state to complete our process. So there are times you may hear, oh, the Corps hasn't issued yet, and it's, you know, but there's a reason sometimes we're waiting for those to kind of finalize at the state level before we can even finalize our permit actions. So we do have a dependency on one another to try to cross-reference and cross-check what we're doing. And then, of course, while we're here today, you know, there's also a lot of local permitting requirements that we work with, and we try to keep our municipalities in the loop as well, so. And when I mention a permit decision, here's our three main types. We can issue as proposed. We can require some modifications or maybe even some special conditions. So we can still allow a permit to be issued, but hopefully to minimize some of the impacts. And then there's also a denial, which again is very rare. I mean, usually it's when someone doesn't want to work with us. They just have a vision and they don't want to change. Well, you know, we again, it's rare, but it's because we minimize and try to avoid impacts. We can make things workable typically. And again, with any paper process, any regulatory process, here's the integrity of the program. It's compliance on our permits we issue, and we also watch out for alleged violations and any unauthorized work that may be taking place. We have inspectors out there pretty much on a daily basis looking at different sites all over the Great Lakes. So we try to keep tabs on those to make sure people are adhering to their permit requirements. And this is really the most important slide of our whole presentation. We got a lot of information on the website. It's a newer website, so if you have it bookmarked, it may not always redirect. But we also have that 800 number on the bottom. It goes to our main receptionist number. We kind of call that our one-stop shop type of number. Anything you want to bring to our attention, whether it's an alleged violation, a resident to refer them to, you name it, give them that number. And we'll get it to the right people in our office, and we'll make sure we follow up and get back with them. And that's all I have for right now. I don't know if there's questions?
I have a
Yes.
question. I don't know if it's for you or for you, but recently there's been some requests for seawalls to be installed, and I understand that there's a requirement out there now that doesn't allow there to be put boardwalks back, that there's a requirement for native plantings.
Yeah, Paige, you want to speak to that? I think, yeah, you're talking about BMPs, the best management practices.
Yep. What you're touching on is EGLE's required best management projects. We require those for all seawall replacements or new seawalls. It has to be something to help, you know, mitigate for the ongoing impact of having a seawall there and the effects that has on the lake. It doesn't have to be a native plant zone always. You know, there are other options for that. You could reduce the length of the seawall.
I guess my concern was, if somebody's putting a seawall in on the back of a canal property, you want to really have access to it, and access would be through a deck or a boardwalk, not necessarily having to walk through a garden of native plantings.
Typically with those, you'd have a break for almost every, speaking personally, almost every permit I've issued with a no-mow zone has at least a 6-foot break for access. And
So what you're
a lot of
saying
the
is
time,
that they could put a deck or a boardwalk and then have native plantings?
yes.
Okay, that's, addresses my
It's a
concern.
very site-specific requirement for us.
Okay.
If we're looking at smaller parcels on these canals, especially in St. Clair Shores, you know, these are, you know, much different than, you know, inland lakes or other areas where there is unseawalled areas that we
Correct.
would want to protect.
Right.
We would take that in mind, and that's what we mean by site-specific. We realize that St. Clair Shores is a bunch of.
So if I ever had to replace my seawall, I'd want to be able to put the decking back in that I have
That's something we talk about.
adjacent to my current seawall.
Yeah.
So I think one of the reasons why people put a dock adjacent parallel with the seawall is because the ground will constantly go down. Because the canal side and the land side want to equilibrate. They want to be equal. So you're always fighting that. So most people go back 5, 6, 8 feet, put a dock, and let the land do what it does, and have to deal with it, so.
And the dock then is at a fixed.
Yeah,
height,
usually
so the
posted
land-
in, yeah, can't move, yeah.
I have a question. It's come up with dredging a lot more in the last couple of years. We've seen all these projects in St. Clair Shores especially. Is it true that there is a period of moratorium on dredging due to, I believe it's fish spawning season? There's
That's
been a little bit of
correct.
confusion with that. I was wondering if you could clarify that for us, please.
We actually get our state windows typically, or the dredge windows from the state, through the DNR. And there are certain time restrictions, and it is based on fish spawning primarily for the main concern on that. That is something that at least the Corps has to coordinate with the state. And I don't know if
Yeah, I
Say a
wanted to
little
say,
more on
yeah,
that.
DNR kind of sets those dredge windows for us, and it's especially important with the dredging because that is kind of, moving the spawning areas of fish. We might decide not to enforce a no-work window if you're just putting some pilings in or docks, But when you're dredging a large area where fish are spawning, DNR likes to see those no-work windows put in, yes. And they do get updated. We can provide those to you. There's like a list of all of the no-work windows in every water body throughout the state.
But those would be taken into consideration when permits are actually submitted for approval.
Yes, we try and get those pushed through before those no-work dates. I know exactly what you're talking about. It's probably our busiest
But-
time of the year.
All the contractors out there should know that if they're coming up against that window where they can't, they shouldn't.
They should not be
They may have
dredging.
gotten a permit prior to the spawning season.
Mm-hmm.
And they should know not to dredge.
That, usually it's put in the permit, in the authorized activity box and in our conditions,
The window.
where the window is.
Okay.
And we'll say any year that this, permit is valid, that work window is in effect.
we try to do the same thing, mirroring that same no work period or no dredge period as well. So that we're consistent with the state.
I would like to add that we are sensitive to the canal mouths in St. Clair Shores filling up, right? I've been issuing permits in St. Clair Shores for a long time, and with Maple, Benjamin, Devon, 10 Mile,
yeah.
right? We will probably not ever enforce that window on just dredging a canal mouth. Okay, so if that canal mouth needs 100 feet of dredging, and that's gonna let the 80 people come out, right? That can probably almost be done without any window, but that's a site-specific and sort of a project-specific thing. If that dredging goes way out into the lake for whatever reason, as we go farther into the lake, the more regulation and the stricter time will be put on that. But dredging in the canals themselves, and especially if you just have a mouth that's shoaled up or sandbarred up, we will work with whomever to get that canal back open. And we vetted that with DNR
Yeah.
Fisheries and.
Yeah,
So
and
DNR
that,
Fisheries is who sets those recommendations, and those are recommendations to us. That's not in our laws or anything, those are just recommendations from DNR Fishery to be protective of the fishery.
be the least impactful. But then, thinking about those canal mouths and prioritizing them kind of goes hand in hand with Army Corps. You need the navigability of the waters. You need the public to be able to access the waters of the state.
I have a question. It's concerning docks extending into the lake. And does the Corps have any guidelines or opinion on how far they can extend, knowing that a homeowner's needs may change with changing lake water? They're going to go farther with lower water.
Yeah.
So how far can we go? To Canada?
Yeah, I think that would be a navigability, yeah.
I can try to answer that. And you're right, everything is on a case-by-case basis, so it does make it tricky to give a specific answer. But certainly, we look at a lot of the adjacent properties, excuse me, how long are their structures in comparison? What other kind of landforms are nearby? I'm thinking of some of the really long docks up in New Baltimore that are right next to their parks, and they're right next to their giant pier that they have at their main park, and as Brandenburg, just as an example. So some of those piers are a lot longer than what they might normally be, but because of the way the shoreline's shaped, because of the structures that are there, and the way the littoral drift interacts with that area. But you're right, I mean, we've seen some low water where there's a lot of reemergent wetlands along the shoreline, which created some challenges years ago on how people get to their boats. Their docks aren't getting out to the water anymore. Their hoists are way out in the water now. So it is something we look at. We have a fairway width, like in canals and more constricted areas. So typically, we don't allow for more than 1.5 times from like maybe a bulkhead, for instance, out into the water compared to the overall distance. So there's safe navigation and room to navigate. But other than that, we don't put a real like specific number on it. I know in some places, they'll even allow for certain wider docks in different situations around the Great Lakes, and sometimes they're a little bit less wide. But yeah, we don't have an actual, like, here's your maximums. We don't do that.
But when you issue the permit, you've taken into consideration the navigability of the placement of that dock.
Correct. We certainly try to do that, and at times, if it's a structure we feel we can't go longer in length, we may consider or try to, suggest maybe dredging as an alternative to make it work where you are. So, but yeah, it's really on a case-by-case basis.
I mean, most people look and say, well, I'm gonna go as far as my neighbor. And you get undulating shoreline. So if you went to as far as you know, and the next guy goes, basically you created a straight line parallel with the shoreline that's gonna deviate 100 feet, 300 feet, 50 feet, 20 feet. So is that something that you look at? I mean, do we wanna do that? Because that's gonna be the end game if we keep going.
Safety becomes an issue too.
I think one of the biggest things when I think of something like that too is we're looking at just the navigation of it. Can you get in and out of there safely? It always makes me think of areas like the North Channel on the St. Clair River. There's a lot of long docks. They're very, some of them are pretty tight. They're on pretty narrow areas. And there are some challenges. I mean, there's no doubt you can't always have two-way traffic coming and going from adjacent properties. It's too tight. But can you safely get one boat in or out of there? So, I mean, I know what you're saying. Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely a challenge.
I'd like to touch on that too. There's also an issue with navigability, right? So the docks that Shawn's talking about up on the North Channel, right? They're going in average water. They're going across water that might only be 2 feet deep. So the expectation of navigability in there is a little less than the water being 30 feet, right? So the things that can navigate in 2 feet of water, canoe, you probably can't run a sunfish in it, but everything but kayaks, canoes, small boats.
Wave runners, you can run wave runners in 2 feet of water on plane.
Right,
And now you're putting people at risk.
right. Well, boating's dangerous. I
Yep.
wouldn't
Yeah.
take my jet ski there. There's a lot of water, right? I mean, the dock length, it's somewhat self-limiting, especially here, because of the sandbars off the mile roads here. But you could build a 300-foot long dock and it's usable this year and it's not usable for the next 8 because the water goes down. I think that people are reluctant to spend that kind of money on something that's so transitory. And the dredging, if we were to allow dredging at like every other house, it'd be filled back in probably in 10 years.
Or shorter.
I don't know the number, but it's not forever, right?
Right.
So I think it's self-limiting to a little bit of an extent on this shoreline especially due to that.
So you gave us your yes and no answer.
Paige, when are you hit it with the state stuff? All right?
Yeah, that's the right size. See that?
Hi, my name is Paige Cavanaugh. I work for the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. I am joined today by Erica Valansky. I recently took over St. Clair Shores for her, so you'll see my name on permits typically now instead. Andy Hartz, our district supervisor, is also here with us. So, rundown of our presentation today, I'm going to go over how to get in touch with us, and the basics of our permitting program and some projects that are popular in St. Clair Shores. So, one thing I would like to stress, for environmental emergencies, please call the PEAS line, which is included right there. That's the Pollution Emergency Alert System. If you called me on Thursday at 5 p.m. and you're like, they're dumping oil into the lake, I don't work on Fridays. I probably won't see that until Monday or Tuesday, right? And at that point, nobody's seen your voicemail for X amount of time. If you call that number, sometimes you can have somebody out there within an hour. And the main thing with that is it broadcasts to everybody who covers that area. So it won't just be going to me, it won't just be going to Andy or Steven, like that everybody gets hit up with that, and that, allows us to better respond to your actual issue. So for emergencies, call that number. Typically, when it comes to reaching out to us, email is going to be your best bet, right? We get a lot of phone calls, and if you send us an email, you're like, hi, my name is John Smith. I'm looking to apply for a permit at this address. Could you send me some more information, right? We can just send that over. A lot of the times when you call one of us, you're going to get followed up with an email anyways, right? I'm going to be like, oh, what's your email so I can send you more information? So for permitting questions, you're going to call me. And I have my email up there. I have Andy's information included as well. And you guys have a copy of this PowerPoint. And then Stephen Lott handles most of our compliance and enforcement and violations. And I included his information up there as well. And you can report a complaint online. If your neighbor installed riprap without a permit, that's something that you could report via the link. So that way, kind of just cuts out the phone call, because that's what we're going to do with your call, is fill that out. Right? So EGLE has a three-tiered permitting system. On the very bottom, we have exempt activities, which isn't technically part of the pyramid, or part of the tiers. Exempt activities are going to be seasonal, structures for single-family homes. That's your temporary boat hoist. That's your temporary dock. Reasonable upland beach sanding. That doesn't require a permit from us. And then moving up, we have our general permits. These are like the teeny tiny project. These are, I'm putting in 6 spring piles. I want a 50-foot boardwalk through wetlands. Kind of things of that nature. Then moving up, we have minor projects. These, are a little bit more in depth, but not like crazy. This is where you're going to see your permanent boat hoist, your seawall replacements, riprap shoreline protection, things like that. And then we have our public notice projects or individual permits. These are things that don't fit into any minor or general permit category. It doesn't necessarily mean it's not permittable, right? It just has to go through a more arduous process. We got to let the neighbors know, we got to notify other agencies, things like that. That's, your new seawall on a natural shoreline, things of that nature. So for general permits, and these are links to the PDFs that have them if you have a copy of the PowerPoint. General permits have a $50 fee. Minor permit categories have a $100 fee. And like I said, the most common in St. Clair Shores are going to be MP3 boat hoist, MP13 docks, and MP42 seawall replacements. You're going to see a lot of those run through here. And then for individual permits, right, these have a 20-day mandatory public notice period, and the fee is between $500 to $2,000. Typically, your $500 fee is going to be something like a reasonable dredge project that doesn't meet the minor, or a new seawall. Your $2,000 is going to be something more akin to like a subdivision, construction and wetlands, or like not even necessarily a new marine. It just depends on the size of the project. There's a way that they calculate it out, and that information is provided when you apply for a project. So our permitting timeline, EGLE has 30 days to review an application for completeness. If you submit an application on April 1, we have until April 30th to look at it to see, is this complete? Do we have all the information? If we don't, we can put it on hold, right? So, if you are missing a couple measurements or you're not providing enough detail, we can, send a correction request, which puts the application on hold until we get that information back, and then we'll re-review it. And then, right, once the permit is complete, for Part 301 wetland protection, we have 90 days. Part 301 inland lakes and streams, we have 60. And then Part 325, which is the most relevant here, right, Great Lakes and connecting waters, we have 90 days for individuals. But for minors and generals, even on the Great Lakes, we have 60 days. It's one of the only ones where minors and individuals are different. But you're looking at 60 to 90 days after the completeness period. Once again, individual permits have that mandatory 20-day public notice period. More often than not, if it meets the minor or the general permit, you're not gonna run up anywhere close to that deadline, hopefully, unless, things are getting pretty crazy. But it could go, that's our statute, like, we can go up to this time. Hopefully it doesn't take up until then, especially for minors and generals. But legally it could. So up here, I have an example of one of our categories. I'm gonna run through like what a boat hoist permit might look like, application. So, right, for the minor, you're limited to 2 permanent boat hoists serving 1 or 2 personal watercrafts each per single-family residence. The structure shall allow for the flowage of littoral materials and water. The structure will not unreasonably interfere with the navigability or boatability of the water involved or interfere with riparian rights. The structure shall not have permanent covers, sides, or roofs. Temporary covers made of canvas or fabric may be included. The structure shall be placed in the center of the property or at least 1.5 times the boat hoist length from any property lines unless it is not feasible based on site conditions. And then for Great Lakes, it's Section 10 waters. Under the Federal Rivers and Harbors Act, the length of the shoreline or size of the proposed structure is not greater than the length or size of similar structures in the vicinity and on the water body. That's kind of like what we were talking about a little while ago. If you want a boat hoist that's 24 feet by 24 feet, but everybody else in your area has 12 by 12, might be a different conversation. And, right, going through this, those were the boxes you'd want to tick if you were applying as a minor. In certain situations, you need 3 boat hoists, you have 3 boats. That doesn't necessarily mean it's not permittable, it just have to be applied for as an individual. So if you're not meeting any of these, it kicks you out of the minor. But then, like I said, that doesn't necessarily mean it can't be done, but we're gonna have to look at it a little bit more in depth. So looking at a set of example plans that I issued a little while ago, right? We have the water body name. We have the length of the existing structure, the length and width of the proposed boat hoist, the distance from the property line, and very importantly, we have the name and address of the property owner. We need to know where the project is, right? If your project plans just have, here's the house, and then your measurements, right? That could be in Canada, that could be in Ohio, like, where is it, right? And for the neighboring addresses, this person included their neighbor's names. You don't necessarily have to do that unless it's a public notice project, in which case we would need that. Not necessarily on the project plans, though. But right, that just helps tie it down. It's once again like, where is this project? Help us put it in perspective. That's why we need the north arrow and the water body name and stuff like that. And then on the cross section, right, we can see the lake bottom, and we can see the existing elevation and then the structure that's actually going in. And then this is an example of what a permit would look like. I did not include page 2 and 3 because it's canned language and it's a lot less interesting, and I only had, so much room on a slide. So we're gonna have the property owner's name and address. It's gonna have the permit number, the date it was issued, the day it expires. It's gonna have the part checked for like what statute we're issuing the permit under. The authorized activity, the affected water body, the project location, and then it's gonna have those permit conditions, right? For this one, the big ones are like the structure shall be of open construction without fill, maintaining free water movement and circulation, stuff like that. It'll have the EQA who issued its name, which in this permit it's mine, and signature, right? And then once a permit is issued, the property owner has to sign it to be like, yep, I saw the permit and I agree with the conditions. So that way, if you go out to a project and you're like, hey, do you have an EGLE permit? And the contractor pulls it out and hands it to you, right? Property owners know where to be seen. We want to see that signature from them saying like, yes, I read this, I know what's going on. Especially if somebody else applied for your permit for you, we want you to be aware of what's in it, right? So that's why we have that signature. So moving on to questions. I feel like I threw a lot at you, and I know a lot of this we talked about in Shawn's presentation as well.
I just wanted to say, we do have the minor and general permit categories listed online as PDFs, and it, you know, you can almost use it as a checklist to, design your project to meet one of those, least impactful categories.
Right. And one other thing about minor projects is it's not necessarily like an auto issue. Just because you meet the minor, there are certain situations where like that might not be appropriate for your site. Those are few and far between, right? Most of the time, if you meet that minor, you're good to go. But sometimes, you know, if there are alternatives available, it's very site specific, but every once in a while, that will come up. So just know that if you meet the minor, it doesn't necessarily mean you are 100% guaranteed to get a permit.
So in most cases, you're going to have the contractor pulling the permit on behalf of the homeowners.
The overwhelming majority will be the contractor applies. And that's one other thing I forgot that I wanted to mention. Say the contractor applies for it, they're involved throughout the whole process. The permit is actually issued to the property owner. It is not issued to the contractor. They'll be copied on it, right? So they'll get a copy, they're part of it. We'll contact them for most of our questions and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, that permit is getting issued to the property owner no matter what.
How many site visits do you take for inspections?
Not all projects need them. For all seawalls and seawall replacements, we do an inspection within 3 years. And for dredging, most of the time we'll want to come out and check out the turbidity curtain beforehand. But for something like a new dock or like a boat hoist, more often than not, we are not going to come out before or after, unless we hear something. Our compliance and enforcement person does go out and check permits randomly, right? So that's not to say no one's ever gonna look at it. But it's not necessarily like a scheduled inspection except for like seawalls and dredging, where we're like, we gotta meet before, after, and during. That's not the case. Most of the time, there won't be a site inspection, except for,
You're talking about after or before, or both?
Like during
After the permit's issued, during work or?
Randomly select a bunch and then you call us. And say, please come take a look.
get a lot of neighbors who are like, does my neighbor have a permit? They're doing blah, 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 blah. Lot of those. So you definitely want to have one and you want to follow it, because if you don't, someone's probably going to tell on you. Plus, like Andy said, we do random inspections.
Talk about the boat hoist minor for just a quick second. Like, give you an example that we're seeing more and more of. One of the conditions in that list of bulleted items was that the boat hoist is placed in the middle of the property, right? Right in everybody's lake view, right in the middle of the property. A lot of people want to move them right over the property line, right? That should not be the minor project category. We will public notice that and alert both of the neighbors. If the neighbors don't say much about that, we're probably ready to issue that, okay? Now, we get a neighbor who objects, and then we go back and we say, hey, slide it back to the middle, and we slide it back into a minor project category. They've already paid $500 for the public notice, there's no refund, we slide you back and you agree to the minor, right? And now you're just angering your neighbors, we're expected to referee that.
Yeah.
So,
Better you than us.
what?
Better you than us.
Well, I understand, but some people are just wed to their ideas, right? And we say, look, that's fine, you know, and for everybody in the room, right? So much, our time, the time it takes to process a permit is obviously the time it takes, like just the manpower. But if it's taking a longer amount of time, that's usually because we're trying to get the project revised to something we can issue a permit for, okay? We could very easily just take the proposal and say, you know what, denied, start over, denied, start over. Nobody wants to do that, right? So when you're seeing things taking an inordinate amount of time, that's because we're working through a neighbor's objection, we're working through a fisheries objection on something, we're working through a property ownership issue, you know, and we don't normally like to just close those things out. So the time it takes is basically trying to get people towards a permittable project. And like Shawn says, I mean, we issue 98% of our permits. Like probably 60% or more are modified somehow, some way from initial proposal. So do you guys see the public notices that we publish? So it goes to the clerk, right? And so the city only gets notification of our permits, the minors, when we issue, okay? So the city sees public notices, and we don't know what the city does with them. They go to the clerks of the cities and townships, and they should be distributed to the entities that are concerned. But the city obviously can comment on any of those applications as they see fit. So a no comment on a public notice sent to a city, we presume the city has no problem with it. So that's somewhat of an implied approval. The silence is an implied approval. We know that they gotta go through you guys.
We don't see the permits until they're approved.
The minors. Right. You would see public notices of a proposed project prior to a permit being issued.
Which I think there's only been one or two since we've seen those, but the minors, yeah, we don't see them till they're all approved and.
Yeah, the only majors we see is at the marinas, right? A lot of what the marinas do isn't a minor because it's a commercial facility.
Yeah, I mean, the fishing pier was one.
Oh, yeah, right.
One we just put up.
Yeah.
And all the redo at Blossoming, right? So, yeah, that was all public notice. I think we issued a couple notices there for different things. So the majority of what both agencies do in St. Clair Shores is minor projects. So think about a letter, a nationwide, what's the other one?
Regional, nationwide,
Regional,
smaller
nationwide,
ones.
that's like our general permit and our minor permit. So they're very close, right? And so any permits that the agencies are issuing should mirror one another. The Corps shouldn't say a 200-foot long dock and EGLE says a 100-foot long dock. That's part of the coordination that we do. They should mirror each other almost to the T.
Yeah, if I could mention something too, this is something that applicants often ask is, why do I care if I get a permit for, let's say, a dock? And we always tell people, at least from our agency, and I'm sure at EGLE you run into this too, but when someone runs into a dock with a boat, the first thing they do is get an attorney. And the first thing that attorney asks, has that been permitted? And so what I'm getting at is, it is a layer of protection. It has had a regulatory review, and it does provide a homeowner, an applicant, with some protection to say, hey, there is another entity that has some expertise in this area that has looked at it and reviewed it. So I always try to remind people out there, although it may seem benign, it may seem common, it's still a good idea to get those permits, even if it's just because of a navigational situation, because those things happen quite a bit. So that was just one thing I wanted to bring
So
up.
we've had issues where a buyer won't buy a house unless they know the permit's been issued to the dock. And now they got issues with lenders, and now the dock's 12 years old, and it's bigger than what we normally issue a permit for, because it didn't have a permit initially. We're probably not gonna issue a permit for that, a structure that we wouldn't have issued a permit. First of all, the creditors, buyers, creates problems.
And I think one thing too, Andy, if I may, just to complement what you mentioned, the timeframes that you all mentioned or asked about. Again, Paige alluded to this, but once we have a complete application, that's when that 60 days or 120 days starts. A lot of times people say, well, I submitted that application 3 months ago. And I said, yeah, we've been requesting additional information. We haven't received it yet. Sometimes that happens. So just be aware that those timelines do start, but we got to have at least the bare minimum of what we need to move forward with our process. We're not trying to be obstinate. We're not trying to be bureaucratic. This is just info we need to issue and do the review properly. So that's all. And like Andy said, if you guys ever have any concerns about something we're reviewing, something going in, a public notice, what have you, please let us know.
You can reach out on a minor project
anytime.
too. If you guys get wind that there's something being proposed that might be a minor project, we'll take a comment on it. We don't have to public notice it to get an interested party. But you're gonna get your turn at it too, before this board. So.
Got a question?
Yeah, just a question going back to the boat hoists. A few years ago, let's back up. For application purposes, if a homeowner wants to put up boat hoist in his canal, and it's got an agreement linked to the canal, do you guys look at the agreements that are part of the subdivisions?
No.
So you don't care about that?
Restrictions and things like that?
Yeah.
That's an internal issue. to
It's
you
an
guys.
internal issue, yeah. All right,
Yep.
so because of the boat hoist is way
Well, and let's
in
take
the
it-
waterway.
Well, take it one step further, roofs
Yeah.
and sides. Right? That's an issue. We've had a couple nasties in the last couple of years, right? Roofs, upper hoists do not meet a minor, so any boat hoist with a roof being proposed will be public notice. Some people are okay with them, some people hate them. Some neighbors are okay, some people aren't. Those aren't easy for us.
It's just not complete yet, so I was just,
Yeah, I mean, because there's been boat hoists put in, instructed, and, you know, and then they put you're on a 50-foot wide lot, and the hoist can handle a 50-foot boat. How do you get it on and off? Without impeding your neighbor if he has a boat or whatever, you know, so I
We
mean,
wouldn't issue that permit probably.
yeah, but if the boat hoist can handle
You're
that,
issuing a permit based upon the tonnage,
Yep.
not the boat.
Yeah, that's
So
a very good
if somebody's
point.
buying a boat that's gonna be larger than the hoist, and it impedes on the property lines, that's up to the homeowner or the adjacent property owner
doesn't- may not
to contact
impede.
the city.
And/or you guys.
Yeah.
And/or
Right.
you guys. So
Yeah.
we issue a permit for the structure.
Yeah,
If
we're
they
not
wanna
gonna,
put a 50-footer on a boat hoist that is okay with us, that's a civil issue between neighbors.
right,
And that has happened.
we're not gonna tell what kind of boat people can buy.
We don't-
Right, we don't regulate the boats themselves.
Isn't there like a navigability, like we have, it's 100 feet wide,
Yep.
the
Yeah.
boat's 50 feet. I mean,
Now, I
How
think
are
you're
we supposed
thinking
to get
about
around?
like canal width, right? And so we do have a general rule of thumb where we want hoists, let's say you have a 100-foot canal, we want hoists to only take up 20% of that canal, so that 40, say someone has another hoist on the other side, there's always gonna be 60% of the canal for navigability. Now, if someone wants to say they have a smaller one and then put a larger boat on there, I can't control what
That's what
people
happens.
do. Yeah, I'm sure it is, but
Yeah,
yeah,
the
we
question
can't
of boats
police
don't
what
pertain
people
in this
buy.
case.
There's some sites up in Algonac where you can't even see the house behind the boat. The boat
Yeah.
is over the property lines. And I don't think anybody's called on it, but I was like, what?
who would enforce that?
That's a really good question. I don't know. Not us.
wake up the attorney.
That may be a civil issue between landowners.
Wake up
Bob?
the attorney.
That may be, yeah.
Okay,
Right.
who would enforce that?
I'm pushing, can you hear me?
I
Well,
can,
you gotta push the talk.
Likely say, in that situation, if that's a dispute between homeowners and the city would likely not get involved in it. Unless it was creating some type of a navigability issue, then we would. But if, for example, if
Stay on
a,
track.
just using the rule of thumb that was told, and a hoist that takes up 20% of the canal width, but somehow somebody puts in a boat that that takes up 30% of the canal, that would be a problem that we would get involved with. But if, we have rules that say that, for example, in canals, that the stern and the bow of the boat can't be any closer than 4 feet to the property line. Some may be closer than 4 feet, but we likely won't get involved unless we get a complaint from the neighbor. And if that's the case, then we would likely issue a violation.
all right,
Because it would be a violation of our ordinance.
okay.
Any other questions?
Any other questions?
We're gonna make our PowerPoint available on this.
I already sent it to them.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
So if you can't get ahold of
Thank you
Paige,
for
just
having
call
us.
me.
Thank
Don't
you.
get in
Thank you.
trouble
We
for
learned a lot.
not returning the call quick enough. Please, you can call me, Erica, Paige, call any one of us.
We really appreciate you guys coming
Thank you
through
very
and
much.
giving a lot of this, because there's been a lot of.